Okay. So we're on camera. David, somebody raised a hand. If you can help attend to that, please. Okay. So it looks like we've got a pretty good quorum of folks that have joined us here. My name is Ron Crabtree, and I'm pleased to be your facilitator. And for today's webinar around this topic of designing yourself to fail in supply chain execution. Oh my, what's that all about? Well, here's a little quiz question. You know, I kind of grew up in the automotive industry, and we were putting into practice some pretty cool stuff 20 years ago. And one of the things that I learned pretty quickly is the answer to this quiz question. How much of the final cost and flexibility of a product or service gets frozen at the end of the design cycle? In other words, what percentage of what it costs to produce it, service it, change it, whatever, is fixed, locked and frozen during the design cycle? And different experts in different industries will give a different answer to that, but anywhere from 40 to 90% of the current costs at the end of design could be frozen going in. And then another thing that I keep running into, particularly in capital.
Welcome back, Ron. You're on mute.
Yeah, welcome, Ron. Yes, you're back.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. And I didn't anticipate David would kick me out here, but we're in good shape. And then to finish up this thought around, 60 to 90% can be locked down. The other phenomena that I've seen occur is if the engineers are actually developing that new product or service, who do they reach out to source things, get their prototype parts, the services, et cetera. And if we fail to get the procurement and supply chain folks involved pretty early, we end up with a bunch of suppliers that are already kind of locked into the design. We've already designed them into the product or service, and to get them out of it becomes almost impossible, right? And that tends to be a real big challenge. So anyway, welcome to today's webinar. We're going to have some fun here with getting into a pretty good group of panelists here and dig into things. Before we get started, though, a word of thanks to one of our supporters, the Product Development Management and Management Association, or PDMA, supporting today's webinar. In fact, one of our panelists sits on the board of directors. So we wanted to thank them for their efforts to help us make this event a success. So today we're going to have some polling questions. We're going to start with an opening polling question around why is it so many firms tend to fail to integrate supply chain and procurement functions early in that new product or service development and design cycle. Have the audience weigh in on that. And then we're going to talk about what insights we can gain from 4 world-class panelists, and I'll have them introduce themselves here in a few minutes, around what are the best practices in 4 different industry concentrations. And those would be capital goods or complex manufactured goods, consumer products or packaged goods and food and things like that, And then financial services, fintech, kind of the bigger services sector. And then finally, software and business services as a focus as well. And each of our panelists is going to take one of those concentrations and address this tricky question. So we have about 50% of the content really aimed at quote unquote people who make stuff, and the other 50% at everybody else, service providers who also develop and bring to market, services, software, and product in the term of services. And at the end, we'll have a wrap-up polling question about what you'd like to learn more about and help prioritize our future learning as we go. So with that, let's just take about 30 seconds each and have each of our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Michael, please.
Thank you, Ron. So Michael O'Connor, Director of Strategy and Project Management at Medtronic. Medtronic is a medical device company, the largest medical device company in the world. We've been in the news a lot with the ventilator work for COVID-19. I've been with them going on 18 years, been in the medical device world for about 30 years, and I've worked in regulatory, quality, compliance, audit, technology, science, research, development, just to name a few. I think I've hit every area but sales and marketing. I have a PhD in civil engineering, majoring in project management. I have a host of other degrees I won't go through. I'm a member of PDMA and many other organizations. And I teach at 3 universities, mainly in graduate project management. So happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Michael. Ernie.
Hi, everybody. My name's Ernie Harris. I am founder of Interesting Blazer, founder and managing partner, a boutique consulting firm focusing in product and innovation management strategy consulting. That's a mouthful. As Ron mentioned, I'm also the chair of PDMA International. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out Michael's being modest. He is also on our board, as is Wayne. So you have 3 board members from PDMA on the call with us today. I've been in the product and innovation space for the past 30 years, and these days focus predominantly on health tech and insure tech spaces, but spent the better part of my career in the fintech space as well. So I'll be representing that aspect for today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Wayne.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. I'm Wayne Fisher. I founded Rockdale Innovation after spending 27 years as an R&D manager at Procter & Gamble. And while I was at P&G, I helped develop and deploy a number of innovation best practices across all phases of new product development. As Ernie said, I'm active in the PDMA. I'm also a member of the Outstanding Corporate Innovator Award Program, which really affords us an opportunity to study best practices, get a look under the hood of some of the most innovative companies in the world. So that's a lot of fun. I have a PhD in chemical engineering, and I have 18 US patents.
Wow, awesome. And then my good long-term friend, Kendall, and I go back, golly, more than 20 years. Kendall, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hey, greetings, everyone. Yeah, my name is Kendall Shear. I started my career in engineering, but soon migrated into everything IT, I would say. And for the past 4 decades, I've had the privilege of being involved in industry from the perspective of the end consumer, that is to say the OEM or the tier 1. Also from the vendor's perspective, that is the software innovator or provider, which is what I'm still doing to this day. And also from the vantage point of the consultant. So within those 3 roles, I've been involved in most industry verticals, but far and away industrial manufacturing and automotive are my long suits. Most of my experience has been with Fortune 500 companies, which has allowed me to experience industry across several continents as globalization has been taking hold, as we all know. And for a significant portion of my career, I specialized on financially justifying projects by identifying the exact sources of business value to be derived from technology initiatives. And it's certainly my great pleasure to be here with you today.
Awesome. Good job. Thank you, Kendall. All right, then. So we're going to do our first polling question. We're going to fire this up in a moment, but we'll just scan this list. So we'd like the audience to weigh in. We just came up with some ideas here. Here are some of the reasons why, at least in our experience, many firms fail to integrate supply chain and procurement early in that new product service development cycle. And I'm going to allow the audience to pick as many of these as they agree with. It probably is true. Poor business cases presented to management, marketing, and engineering. They're the experts. So why do we need those supply chain guys? there's never time. We're always in this big rush. We never can make the time to really include and involve those functions. Maybe we lack the resources in supply chain and sourcing to actually participate in new product and service development. Maybe it's just because we'd have to change something. We're not into change, right? It's just not our culture. Maybe it's a lack of a good defined work process. You know, maybe the whole thing is a top secret endeavor, right? We don't tend to involve others other than just the close little community to do development. Or maybe it's just the domain of two functions only, one or two, and we really don't want to include anybody else. Maybe it's our culture, right? Sales and marketing run the show and everybody else follows their lead. And then maybe it's good intentions. You know, we talk about involving everybody early in the process, but somehow it just never seems to happen. Audience, please pick as many of these as you like, but at least 3 that to you are probably some of the reasons why we don't do such a great job. So let's run that polling question now.
And Ron, we're not actually seeing the
Okay,
slides.
Ron, I just launched that.
Okay. We're not seeing the slide?
Correct.
All right. So
We see the poll now.
Yeah,
but
we see
don't
the poll.
see the
Very
slides.
good. Yep. Yeah, the slide will be gone while we're running the poll. So we got a super summary here. We'll ask people to weigh in and pick 3 or more of these that to you very well could be the big issue we run into. And we'll let the poll run until we see, you know, at least 50 to 60% participation in the poll. David, do we have responses coming in?
Yes, we do, Ron. We're at
Perfect.
35 so far, so we're right at 50%. I was going to leave it open for another 20 seconds.
Awesome. Go, go, go. And then we'll show some statistics here in a moment.
Okay, ending that and sharing results.
Oh, here we go. So a little drum roll here. And let's scroll it down real slow here. We see we had 56% picked marketing engineering, think they're the gurus. Why do we involve those guys? And then the lack of a defined process, nearly 50% of responses being the next biggest one. That's a bit of a surprise. We lack skilled resources in procurement to participate would be number 3 on this list. And let's see, we got a poor business cases presented, came up with about 30%. And 25% for our culture tends to be a bit of a roadblock. So awesome. Thank you for that audience participation. And we're going to move on. But one of the things I did with the panel for fun is I asked the panel to do the same thing. You know,
Hey,
everybody
Rod,
picked
I
the
hate
top
to
3.
interrupt.
Yes. Yes.
We're not seeing your slides.
All right. Very good. So let me fix that problem. And we're going to close the poll. And we have a warning that the host has disabled screen sharing. Let's get that
That might be the
corrected,
side
and then
effect
we'll
of
move
getting
on.
dropped.
Then we'll definitely move on. There we go. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay.
Yes.
Back in business here. All right. Now let's just cut to the chase here. I had our panelists kind of weigh in too, and their consensus was all of them pretty much saying, you know what, the lack of skilled resources to support us is a really big deal. And that correlates pretty strongly with what the audience thought as well. And also, you know, strongly correlated with the lack of a good defined work process as well. So I think in this webinar, we're going to learn a lot about process, what to focus on, you know, how we can do that. And we'll certainly arm the audience with some ideas about how we can skill up and things to think about moving forward. How can we be more effective as sourcing and procurement professionals in this entire product development cycle in the future. So good job on that. We're going to move into our first question. We're going to rotate through the panelists differently. So for the first question, we're going to have Michael start us off, followed by Ernie, Wayne, and then Kendall. Question 2, we'll start with Ernie, and we'll cycle through, and then on to question 3. So the question for each panelist, Michael will take this one first, is, you know, what in your mind, now remember, Michael's going to focus in on, and I think you'll say it, complex capital, right? I design it, I make it, I bring it to market, I serve it in the life cycle, complex products. Whereas Wayne's going to be taking more of the consumer packaged goods approach, food products, consumer goods, Ernie around financial services, and then Kendall around software and business services would be the 4 concentrations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wayne. We've got a little picture we can share right here.
No, Michael.
I'm sorry, Michael.
Yep, thanks, Ron. So appreciate it. You can see the picture here is a Micro, which is a Medtronic leadless pacemaker. It's been out for about 2 years. It's the only type of product in the market. And what it is a leadless pacemaker. We have no leads. Currently, a pacemaker has leads. This doesn't need that. You can see those tines sticking out. That fixates in the heart wall, and there you have it. It comes up through the femoral artery, and you don't have to do a cut down in the chest, and it's pretty incredible. But what's even more incredible is we disrupted our own market with that. So we are the leaders in pacemakers, and we disrupted the market with that. So it's an incredible but very complex product, and it probably took about 12 years to come to commercialization. So just wanted to lay the groundwork with that. That's what we're dealing with when we talk about Medtronic, very complex medical devices. So the first thing that I have here is begin early in planning. You need to get a purchasing or a supply person on your team, and we use what's called core teams, and we have typically development, regulatory, purchasing, marketing, clinical, et cetera, that make up this team. And it's very important to have someone early to get the success of the launch. If we don't have that, the planning may not be smooth, the project may not be smooth. The other thing is design with the long term in mind. This is something that a lot of people, project managers, marketing folks, they get lost. You know, our products take a long time to get out in the market, so a lot of people cycle through the project. But we need to have the highest quality and reliability in these products. And the end goal is the patient. And that can't be stressed enough. So that long-term focus needs to be in place. And we need to work with the suppliers like sterilization and environmental factors to make sure that we have these things in place. And that if someone else comes in, they know what the design is and they know how the long-term is going to look. And that's what's very important now with COVID and all the touch points. We also need to have a long shelf life. Things are sitting in salesperson stock in their trunks and whatnot. But design with the long term is a big piece, and that takes supply and purchasing effort. And that brings me to the last point here is second source. And you're going to hear all 3 of these again. But second source, in my experience, and I've been in med device for about 30 years, is extremely important. I've seen many successful products get somewhere out in the market and we have a problem with, say, a polyurethane or a silicone. We don't have a second source. And to do the validation and the verification that is needed takes a lot of time. And we don't have time typically to do that. So that's very important. And I would have to say it's something that I've seen not only at my current company, but other companies, that it's not always baked into the plan. And a lot of that is due to project managers and core team folks. All they're worried about a lot of times is getting the product out to the patient and on to the next project. But we have to think about the second source and how we need to add that into the plans and be prepared, because people go out of business, things happen, and we've seen it all too often. So those are kind of my top 3, and I'll speak more of this as we go throughout this presentation. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So we're going to switch now to Ernie. But I did talk to a company a few weeks ago that were really sorry they had a single source supplier in Italy. And they were like really, really struggling. So Ernie, I'll let you take it up now. Same question.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ron. You know, I'm going to dovetail into what Michael says. We're all going to overlap a lot in the Venn diagram of life here. But when you're talking about, you know, non-tangible products or services, you know, particularly in financial services, there's a lot of focus on the cutting front edge of the service, right? What is actually the market seeing? And it's mostly underpinned by technology. And so the product team tends to often abdicate themselves from operations and technology and things like that. And they just focus on the service that's going to be put into the marketplace. And somebody else will worry about that. But I've called out 3 things that historically have proven to be kill points in projects that I've been involved with. Labor is always a good one. If you're offering a service, there's usually some people behind that service, whether it's developers or call center folks or what have you. But more and more, it's transitioning from a function of, hey, let me find if I have an available labor source with the right skill set. And now I also need to have a labor source with the right skill set, but the right culture on top of that. And that tends to be sometimes a significantly smaller subset of the whole. So that's an area where we spend a lot of focus making sure that we have 1, 2, 3. Virtualization obviously becomes a big discussion there. Dovetails into the next one, right? Facility and technology scaling points, right? So regardless of what you're doing, there's always going to be a scaling point somewhere. And being thoughtful about those points and understanding there's nothing more expensive than unplanned facilities builds. So you really do need to understand what your progression is, what your ratios of resources are, both technology and labor, to the widget production of your service. And then lastly, very similar to the second source model that Michael spoke to. We're not often dealing with silicon or polymers in financial services, but we are dealing with data a lot. And you know, a lot of things are built around industry standards like Morningstar star ratings, right? That there's only one Morningstar star rating, and it's produced by Morningstar. So people don't even bother to look at what would happen if Morningstar went out of business, because up until a decade ago, that was a silly thing to contemplate. And now with a litany of dead behemoths before us, we're now starting to contemplate, well, maybe we need to build in artificial flexibility to plan for a catastrophe.
Good job. Thank you, sir. Going to move on to Wayne and switch up here to consumer goods.
All right. So for me, the most important aspect of consumer product design is having a relentless focus on value. And we define value as the benefit of the new product to the consumer divided by the cost. Now, understandably, when you're at the earliest phases of new product development, you know, your product designers, they have to be focused on developing prototypes that really deliver a meaningful consumer benefit. That's their job. That's what they're really good at. But as soon as we have that prototype in hand and we're convinced the consumer's excited about it, the focus needs to shift to cost. So we should be thinking from the earliest stages of development, what are the things we can do to reduce the amount of capital required to get that product into the market in the first place? What can we do to reduce the operating costs across the supply chain of putting that product on the shelf at Walmart? You know, so, you know, that it is the second thing you do, but it's got to be done at that early stage. So two of the tools that we use to do that, right? The first is conceptual process design. And so the principle here is that, again, early on, we should be very divergent. Be thinking about what are all the different ways that we could be making this product at full scale. So you diverge and then you converge on what you think would be the lowest cost, fastest to produce, et cetera. And then develop a should cost analysis for that suggested process. So again, this is, you know, days, perhaps weeks worth of work, but it can be done in parallel with the product design. And the other thing that we want to do is be thinking about what changes can we make to that prototype that would make it easier to manufacture, that would make the supply chain more flexible for future product changes, but without sacrificing the benefit of the consumer. So again, the longer we wait to answer these kinds of questions, the harder it's going to be to influence the design of the product or the supply chain. So again, we've got to get this done early on.
Awesome. Good job. Thank you. And now Kendall, I'll let Kendall take a crack at it more from the software and services development perspective.
Sure, thanks, Ron. So yeah, within the software and business services sector, three critical things come to mind that can be helped by including procurement and sourcing personnel early in the upfront design process, and those can drive some great value downstream. The first one of those, it would be the anticipation or the sourcing of the right skill sets for development, marketing, and field operations. And the second one would be anticipating and sourcing the right tools that will best enable the organization. And the third one would be aligning the timing and the ramping up of those resources, tools in conjunction with the business plan. So really the general idea is that the procurement and sourcing people will hear what the organization is planning to develop for the market, and they will hear what skill sets will be needed in order to fulfill that vision. And through constant interaction with the software and business services designers and business planners, the procurement people can better identify and plan for the necessary skill sets, the timing, and the other logistics that are required to ramp up the new initiatives. And all too often, the understanding of what is needed is conveyed late, forcing a real scramble and potential delay of onboarding those requisite skills. Worse yet, the organization, due to that scramble, resorts to bringing on skill sets that are not as good a match, which sometimes requires extra time to train and ramp up, often delaying the desired start time. So in the software and business services area, delayed starts can cause missed opportunities and missed market share. And just as important as bringing on the right skill sets, it's important to anticipate, budget for, and bring on the requisite tools that enable that workforce to function at peak efficiency. And then lastly, I would say aligning the timing of the resource plan with the business plan is what's going to allow the vision to be achieved to its maximum potential.
Wow, awesome. Good job, Kendall. So you probably would agree, my son's a programmer, and he made an observation that last 3% of the code is 80% of the effort of the project. Because that's when everything comes home to roost. Like, well, wait a minute, that's not the functionality we want. Wait a minute, we really wanted to do this. And it can just spiral out of control, and that's very much, an indication of what we're talking about here. So great job, Kendall. And we're going to move on to question 2. And so now I'd like each of the panelists, with respect to those 3 things they're really saying in these 4 sectors, what's the benefit of that? What do we get out of it? And ideally, how would we measure it? And I've challenged them a little bit with, if we didn't involve sourcing and procurement, and then we did, how much delta or difference are we really talking about? So I challenged the panelists to try to treat that a little bit in their answers here. So with that, we're going to start with Ernie this time. Ernie, you can take it away.
Again, thanks, Ron. Who doesn't like a good Dilbert? So I thought this would be a good backdrop to talk over. The measuring soft goods, soft services, things like that, usually gets a bad rap because people say, well, they're all soft measures. And the reality is that's true. A lot of them are, but many of them are not. So I would challenge back and say, for example, we all know how to measure available labor resources, right? There's a ton of places we can do that. Recruiting and talent acquisition programs do that very, very well. But managing culture is actually getting pretty easy as well with our sentiment analysis, whether you know it or not. People are measuring your sentiment. Every time you post something online, you're getting a score. So while China does it overtly with their social score, everybody else does it covertly. So we can now start assigning some cultural values to the available labor pools as well. Is it hard? Is it a little creepy? Sure. Is it doable? Absolutely. But it helps you avoid the scenario here we have with Dilbert, where 87 surveys point to the fact that made up numbers are just as good as real ones. So the benefit of doing that is clear, right? If you have enough labor of the right skill set, you can deliver on what you're looking for. The downside, if you're not getting the right culture in your product mix, you end up a lot of times with unforced errors. And my favorite unforced error, sitting on a panel of engineers, right, is engineers, no disrespect meant, my fine gentlemen, but tend to be very precise. So a lot of times you'll ask an engineer a question and say, Wayne, what's it going to take for me to get this product to market? And Wayne's going to answer with an excruciatingly specific answer. And then he's going to walk away muttering under his breath, that dummy didn't even ask the real question, right? And that's a cultural problem. That's not a skill set problem. So solving the cultural rift of everybody owns everything, success and failure, I think is the top 3 things. But to touch briefly on the rest, facilities and technologies, same thing, right? You can measure those, you can quantify those. Soft goods, same thing, you can measure and quantify those. But the big thing I would foreshadow for the rest of this talk is quantifying them is one thing, measuring them is another thing. Doing that consistently is success.
Awesome. Good job on that. Thank you. With that, we're going to transition to Wayne. and back into consumer goods. Wayne? Whoops.
And Ernie, you're absolutely right. Not only am I an engineer, but our measures are a lot harder. And I think they're easier to measure. But anyway, I think you look at the benefits of doing integrated design. The first is just faster development cycle times. To be honest, I get a little frustrated when people say, we don't have time to do this. I mean, for me, the only time that matters is how long is it going to take me to see that product on the shelf at Walmart, right? I don't know what time you're talking about, but that's the only measure that counts. So, that's probably the most important of these three measures. The second, of course, is, the cost to get into the market and the cost to deliver those goods over time. Now, I have to say, the third, increasing supply chain agility. This is the soft of these three. It's hard to put a good measure on if I do this product design or this process design, I'll be able to include new raw material suppliers when we go around the world. That's a little softer, but the other two are pretty firm. But I have to say, I've done many front-end innovation workshops at my career at Procter & Gamble and beyond. And I can make this promise to you, right, that you spend, a few days on the front end and you're going to save a few months on the back end, right? It's empirical, but it's over so many data points. And the question is, well, why is this? And I think it's because when we do critical path schedules for projects, they never include the inevitable technical problem solving that has to go on along the way, right? And so the sooner you involve your product supply partners, they're going to be able to identify what are those potential problems, the technical challenges of scaling up, and start to address them earlier. Within chemical engineering, we have a famous axiom that we should commit our blenders on the small scale and make our profits on the large scale, right? So if you're doing an over the fence kind of an approach to new product development, you're just making your blenders at a larger and larger scale than you have to. Now, on the flip side, while we say supply chain should be early involvement, in order for them to earn a seat at the table, they really have to show up early and look like help.
There you go.
To their product designers and commercial partners. And there's lots of ways they can do this, but just some examples. They can offer to make product prototypes at a somewhat larger scale for early consumer testing. So again, they're leveraging their expertise, but they're also learning early on how to make these products. And they can foresee, it's hard to make thousands. It's going to be really hard to make millions. So by getting involved early and looking like help, you can earn your seat at the table. People will welcome you.
All right, awesome, good job, thank you. I'm going to move on to Kendall now and shift and talk again about software and related.
Sure, thanks. And as I see it, the measurable benefits for software and business services, if you were to bring procurement and sourcing in earlier into that design and business planning cycle, I see, there's going to be three of those. And the first one would be, you're probably going to lower your onboarding costs of, new personnel that are coming into that project. I'll explain that maybe a little bit later. And then lower your personnel turnover as well. And that might be as much as 15 to 30%.
Wow.
And then third would be improving your market capture. And that could be maybe even 10 to 25%. So, these are potentially significant percentages. It kind of depends on your baseline, your starting point, so on. But, those are frequently realizable numbers. So the first two of those areas, as shown on that chart, is that those contribute to driving down costs, which is always important. But because there is much better anticipation of the demands of the market and the organization's plans to meet those demands. With that better foresight, the procurement sourcing function will operate more efficiently and more effectively. So you're driving down those costs, on that procurement side. But I think that the real big payoff comes with that number 3, so to the right side of our picture, via improved market capture. And that happens because by better timing the ramp up of new initiatives and having put in place a best match of skills, tools, timing, and market capture, you can then maximize that compared with a more reactive approach.
Awesome. Good job. All right, so we're going to have Michael back cleanup on this topic for us.
All right, so thank you, Ron. So yeah, I agree with a lot of all the panelists have said. I'm not going to say anything that's going to be that much different. You can see in this picture here, this is a picture of a gentleman with our ventilators in Galway, Ireland. And we just want to make a comment. We moved from making about 250 a week. I think in June, we're going to be at about 1,200 a week. So about 5 times the capacity and production. And of course, that takes a lot of supply. And I'll talk about some of that more, but pretty incredible. But again, planning, I talk about, and one of the key things I think in planning is partnerships with suppliers. So I'm in a corporate science and technology role. I've been at Medtronic 18 years, but I still have very good partnerships with companies like 3M, GE, and the like. And I keep those partnerships because it helps other people within the business. So I think that partnership is important, and that does help planning, but also that comes with communication with having that partnership. And you need to have your supply purchasing people to have those partnerships more than the engineers. Sometimes the engineers like me have those, but it's very important. And in measurable terms, people have said it, the project's going to add cost and time if those things aren't done correctly or right. So that's a pretty easy one. Again, in the long term, those things need to be documented. And I think that came up in the first polling question. Documentation is very important. And as engineers, that's the last thing we want to do is document. We like to keep it up here. And when the FDA comes in and they hear it's up here, they don't like that. They want to see it on paper. It's very important because we're all moving around, orgs change, people change. So that's very important. And we don't have any idea of why a supplier might have been picked or chosen for something. We need that documentation down. And again, that those things don't happen, it's going to probably be more cost and time. And then the last one is on the second source. For us, again, that second source, the regulatory pathway is a huge piece of that. So we have 510Ks or pre-market authorizations because we have implantables or we have less than 30-day products like a catheter that might go in and come out right away. But a pacemaker is a long-term implantable, so it takes a PMA. A PMA takes a couple of years sometimes just to review because there's clinical trials and other things with that. So if we have to switch again a polymer, a silicone, a polyurethane, that takes a lot of time. And even to create the right design, the engineering takes time, let alone find the right supplier. So these are the kind of things that need to be thought out, and I can't stress enough in the projects that I've been in, I haven't seen it done that well in most of them, and only in a few done well. But you don't know that until it gets too far down the road, and those people have gone, they've left the company, they've retired. So it is very important. And again, the measurement for us is the patients aren't going to get the products. So if we're held up, our mission is to alleviate pain, restore health, and extend life. And if we don't get these things out there, we're not getting to the patients. And that can't be any more true than you see this picture with our ventilators. We need to get them out there. We need to get them done. And so it's very important.
All right, awesome. Good job. Thank you. All right, so we're going to move on now to the third and final question, and it's always my favorite, right? So we heard about, okay, here's the things that come into play, the things we really should be thinking about. Here's potential benefits, but at the end of the day, how do we do it? How do we make it happen? So each of our panelists are going to tackle now what are very specific strategies and tactics that you can recommend to our audience that they could take to go implement so that we can realize those benefits around those 3 key areas that you talked about. And for this question, Wayne's going to get us started, and then we'll end up back at C here with Ernie to do wrap up on this one. So Wayne, if you can take this one away.
All right, thanks, Ron. So the first thing I would recommend is taking a very deliberate organizational design approach to creating and strengthening your company's new product development work process. Now, when you look at our earlier polling questions, and you raise issues like, we don't have the right resources in place, or we're too busy, we don't have a well-defined work process, this is the job of 1 or 2 functions. I mean, this is, clearly an organizational design problem. Now, the model that I use, shown here, is the Galbraith STAR model. And it begins with strategy. Do we have the right strategy in place that's driving our new product development process? Are we organized in the right way? Do we have the right structure? Do we have well-defined processes? And then some more intangibles. Do we have the right reward systems? And this is what drives a lot of your culture. And then finally, do we have the right people in the right place to do that work? So, this is, kind of the systematic approach that I would typically use to help companies improve their success in new product development. And there are plenty of other good models out there. This one just happens to be open source, and I can talk about it. And if you think about strategy in today's environment with COVID, every company on the planet should be, revisiting, is our strategy still the right strategy? So, anytime's a good time, but right now in particular is a great time to be revisiting your organizational design. The second thing is there are a lot of great best practices out there. Specific example around innovation work processes is the PDMA's body of knowledge. So, I think the key is to go through the organizational design work process, understand which of these best practices are most important to incorporate into your company on an ongoing basis, and then start running some pilots, right? So most companies, don't need to make, a major redesign, but every company should be thinking about, as we do innovation projects, how do we use those projects as opportunities to begin to practice some of these emerging best practices or well-documented best practices, and grow our innovation capability, continually improve organizational design. We like to use the phrase, innovate how you innovate. So I think you just need to make organizational design and continual improvement of the entire design, not just the processes, but continual improvement across these 5 vectors will begin to drive your long-term innovation success. This is what we find in all of the innovative companies that we study through our outstanding corporate innovator program.
All right, awesome, good job. Thank you so much. We're going to move on and have Kendall take a crack at that answer.
Sure. So Ron, in order to answer that, let me first review what I mentioned earlier, and that's what we're trying to anticipate and source the right skill sets for development and marketing, field operations, and anticipate and source the right tools that will enable the organization, right? And 3, align the timing for ramping up the resources in ideal coordination with the business plan. So if we're going to, realize those percentage improvements that I alluded to, when answering question number 2, here's some key strategy and tactic that I think will help achieve those results. And so during the design phase for new software and business services initiatives, and perhaps even earlier, but I would go back clear into the visioning phase, include the procurement and sourcing folks in those meetings and or communications. Besides the fact that via their inclusion, these people may contribute a surprising amount to the design and vision. At a minimum, those meetings will shed early light on the anticipated skill sets, technologies, tools, and timing required by those initiatives. Procurement and sourcing will thereby be inherently informed when to plan and when to actually acquire. The value is going to then stem from the fact that the resource planning will already be done and in place in advance of the actual need. So when the business plan is finally approved, green lighted, set into motion, the resource plan can immediately go into effect, dramatically improving the chances that the right resources in the right quantities and at the right time will be available when the initiative actually needs them. And then as a side benefit, if you choose to play it this way, is there can also be improved visibility to those resources rolling off other initiatives as to when and where they can be absorbed into these new initiatives. This can ultimately lower attrition and turnover by providing a better sense of security to the personnel who might otherwise be inclined to look outside their firm for the next opportunity. So I'm sure there's more strategies and tactics we could talk about, but in my opinion, this is where we should start.
Awesome, good job. Awesome, great job. Thank you so much. With that, we're going to shift on to Michael. Same
Yeah,
question.
thank you, Ron. So just wanted to tell a quick story. You can see on the right-hand side here, Elon Musk, his tweet about working with Medtronic. I just found out yesterday at a meeting that Elon Musk reached out to one of our senior leaders in our Northridge, California area and said, hey, how can we help? Within 35 minutes after that text, they had a meeting. That was on a Friday. On Saturday, they had another meeting with leadership and our CEO. Sunday, they had one more meeting, and on Monday, they were actually starting to make things. So I'm saying that, paraphrasing it very brief, but you can see that things can happen, they can happen quickly, but that's a relationship. Elon knew someone at Medtronic that he called, and those things happen. You can see here in the other picture the ventilator that we make, and then the other thing is called a co-venter on the right-hand side there. It's a very simple ventilator. It's a VMU bag down there, and it's just an actuator arm. But the University of Minnesota reached out to us with our competitors, Boston Scientific and United Health Group, and we created a consortium in a week. And now Boston Scientific is manufacturing these, United Health Group is buying these, and they're getting them to their hospitals in South America. So again, connections, those types of things. It was already said, but the early planning, it needs to be built into your strategy. And those things need to have the relationships and the communications, as I talked about before, and it needs to start in the beginning of the project. It can't be stressed enough. It sounds simple, but it can't be stressed enough. On the designing for long term, this also needs to be in the strategy, and this needs to be pushed into terms of making it happen. We have something called design, reliability, manufacturability, which bottom line is good engineering. And these are the kind of things we're making project managers put into their projects. And part of that is supply. Where's your supply coming from? Your purchasing? How is that all orchestrated? And we know it's important now, right? With COVID, we see how supply happens and doesn't happen, and it has a big effect on things. So this needs to be from the start, the beginning, and the end. And then, as I said about before, second source. And this has to happen. And again, it needs to be in the strategy and the planning, and project managers are going to push back on this because they're going to say it's going to slow me down to have a second source. But again, these problems don't come up till later, and this is important. So the strategy piece that people have been talking about, that's very important, and that needs to be laid out, and it needs to happen. And you can see from the Elon Musk, the Tesla, the co-venter, those things happen because we had good communications and we had strategies and we had those connections. So yeah, a strategy is very important here.
Awesome. Good job. Thank you so much, Michael. So Ernie, you get to do cleanup on this one.
I love it. I love it. So I'm going to double down on Wayne's comment around PDMA and starts with strategy. And I think we've been around, we being PDMA, have been around for more than 40 years now, and conduct a lot of primary research around product development process. And there's no avoiding the fact that there is a direct correlation between people that have a solid strategic framework in place are successful versus those that aren't. It's undeniable. But going back to something Kendall had on one of his slides, there's never enough time to do it right, but there's always enough time to do it over. And I couldn't agree with that more. So almost everybody has a mission, a vision, a value statement. Almost everybody has a corporate strategy, but that's about where it really starts to drop off precipitously. So from a practical execution perspective, I would encourage you to really understand how all the different strategies, and just understanding the fact that there's more than one is often a new thing to some folks, right? How these integrated strategies work together to deliver against a goal. The second thing that I would say that's critically important is, you can't manage what you don't measure. We all know that axiom. But a lot of people get lost in the mechanism, right? So they start out and they say, oh, I'm going to create a balanced scorecard. I'm going to create a management dashboard. I'm going to buy this tool from SAS. Not that I don't have anything against SAS. Many of my friends work there. It's an awesome company. But, right, you don't need 300 metrics to determine if you're successful. Sometimes you only need 3. So don't boil the ocean. Get started. The best measurement dashboard is having one, right? And then last, you absolutely have to maintain that. So all of these things plug into sourcing, right? Because some of your metrics are going to be measured through the lens of sourcing and through the lens of resource availability and resource constraint. But if you spend all this time, and I can't tell you how many thousands of dollars people have paid me to come in and build these types of initiatives for them, and then 3 years later, my phone rings and they say, hey, you know, it's time to refresh that. I'm like, dude, you don't understand what I told. What do you mean refresh that? Where's the last 36 months of data? So have a strategy, have some metrics for success, and execute against those two things consistently. That's my message.
Awesome. Good job. All right. So awesome job to the panel. We're going to move into Q&A here in a few minutes, give a chance to the audience to come back with questions. But before we do that, we have a polling question. We'll pop that up here in a moment. But here are the 12 things that our panelists talked about. First 3 Wayne talked about. The second 3 were from Michael. The next 3 from Ernie, and the last 3 were with Kendall. I'll give you a second to kind of scan this. These are like the core things they talked about. And what we're interested in is, by way of just picking the one, which you pick as many as you like, which of these 12 things are you most interested in learning more about? And we're looking for that feedback, because we may expand on that in future webinars or perhaps future communications back to folks that participated. So let's start that polling question now. Pick as many as you like, and let's get a sense for what it is people would like to know more about. So we got the polling question on screen now. We'll let this run for a minute or two, and then we'll take a peek at what we get with the feedback we're going to gather here in this short survey.
While we're waiting on feedback, Ron, I thought it was kind of interesting when we looked at the data that came out at the front of the call around, I think if I remember right, 42% of the respondents said that engineers are too smart and they know better. And yet a panel of all engineers didn't select that as a reason. That was really got me head scratching on that one.
Well, I think it's because of all of your experience and been there, done that, and been paddled for it before. So you kind of know better. But if you don't know any different, right? And worse yet, you've been successful, then, why change?
No, I agree. But I think the other one though really speaks to your organization, right? So from a purchasing association perspective, best practices and the lack of skilled sourcing and purchasing. I mean, that was kind of a duh moment for me. Well, why don't I go see David and he can solve that for me?
Absolutely. All right, so are we ready to show results? I think we may be. All right, here we go. Okay, get to rock and roll. So that is interesting. We had quite a few picks on all of these. We got 55% each for the very first 2. Value equals product benefit, and then reducing total delivered cost. Closely followed, we had the biggest one was second source strategy, 58%. That's interesting. I didn't expect that. 58% around how do we really go after second source strategy. 2 at 55% that I mentioned earlier. We've got one down here, 52% around, anticipate and sourcing the right skill sets, the right tools. Interesting. And that's particularly around software development, surprisingly enough, but I think kind of a universal thing, because what I'm learning is I learn more and more, you talk about digital transformation and the speed of which technology, Industry 4.0, digital transformation, whatever you want to call it. The fact is we need to integrate technologies more and more and more into future products and services going forward. Internet of Things, internet connectivity, edge sensors, a bunch of other cool stuff. Well, we got to have the right people to do that, the right skills and tools from a technology perspective that can link to that and help us make that happen. And let's just take another 50% beginning early with the planning. Sounds good, but tell me more about that and how to really make that work. And a lot of close followers here. So I want to tip my hat to the audience as a deep thank you for that feedback. So with that, we're going to close the poll. And we're going to pass by this next polling question in the interest of getting to the Q&A a little quicker. And we'll save this for a future discussion. And just briefly, I wanted to share on the behalf of Next Level Purchasing Association, we talk about skilling people up. It's very rarely read about it in a book. It's mostly about doing it and making it happen. So the learn it, do it model is a way of selecting from the commercial off-the-shelf training materials, pick out the specific things we need to elevate team skills on now, and then get expert support, right, to teach, learn, go do, and implement, and then use that to kick off those all-important metrics that Ernie talked about. You can't measure it, can't prove it, right? And then institutionalize what works and just get into a rinse and repeat cycle. David Millington's the best contact to learn more about how that works. And then we also have another webinar coming up June 18th, which I hope you will rejoin us. We're going to talk about sourcing and supply management in the new normal. And basically there's 4 categories of organizations we're going to kind of discuss with subject matter, different panelists, subject matter experts. You know, for those that got a big lift out of this and their world changed on a high end with growth and all kinds of things, what's next for them? Does it collapse, or what happens? How about the organizations that were considered essential? They're kind of swimming along. And now at the end of COVID, what happens? And how should we be ready for that? And then you have the entire food supply chain. We had a lot of concerns about the food supply chain blowing up. So what are we going to be doing about that in the next year, right away? And then finally, what about those other organizations? A lot of them have been crushed by the downside of the COVID epidemic. And you start to come out of that, right? This starts to relax and we go back in. The world's a different place now. So how is that going to work? So come join us for that webinar as well. So with that, here's what we covered today, right? We got through the polling question to open things, get a sense for the audience. Closing polling question. Thank you to the panelists. Wonderful dialogue here. I really like you were able to play off each other here a little bit. And of course, learning more about was always important. So with that, I'm going to take a breath and see if David has any questions to tackle with the audience.
Nothing as yet.
All right, well, this is a great time. If you have questions for our panelists and you'd like to pose a question, you use the question tool. And in the meantime, I'm going to invite all 4 panelists if they'd like to make a comment or suggest some kind of a thorny kind of question maybe people are thinking about. Any panelists who would like to offer something up, we can talk about that for a moment.
I didn't want to be selfish, Ron.
Go ahead.
But I'll jump in.
I see
So,
a question in the
oh, we do.
chat.
Oh, great.
Yes, from Maribel.
Okay. What's the essence of the question?
What she's asked is, she says, when I first started in supply chain management consulting, many of the engineers I worked with on projects didn't realize that much of the subject matter had overlap.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Very interesting.
Let me comment in there, Ron, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
That would be, I think a lot of what we all are trying to drive towards here in this world where we're, for example, Michael's ventilators, we all know the pressure, the time pressure to bring those out extremely quickly. And yet at the same time, you don't want to do that, dropping any quality. So it takes a real systems approach. You got to get a lot of parallelism going, which means you kind of got to get all the teams working together. And it's not a sequential process as much as it's a parallel interacting process. And that by itself will inherently take care of this question about, overlap. If the groups, and that was my point too today, was, if the procurement and sourcing people can come in earlier in the cycle, they're ready to take their step much sooner and probably much more accurately, again, by bringing the teams together, not being quite so compartmentalized. So I'll drop it at that, but that's my thought.
Right. Any other panelists care to comment before we move on?
I was going to actually point out Kendall's point, right? But I'd like to add on to that, Kendall, when people say, let's bring people in earlier to the process. What I see is a lot of people think that means bring them in to the extreme bleeding edge of the fuzzy front end, where there's hundreds or perhaps thousands of concepts that are being evaluated. And the pushback you usually get is, well, we don't have enough staffing or sourcing resources to help in that process. And from my perspective, that's not where we're saying engage. It's 2 or 3 cuts down below where you're really trying to build out your portfolio of ideas. So it goes from 1,000 to maybe 10, and that's where you really get your attach point.
But I would add to that, Ernie, in our case of complex medical device equipment, like the ventilators, we do usually have the supply people or someone from purchasing way up front in the technology and the fuzzy front end. We actually exchange every month. I get an update on all the sourcing, all the new things happening, and they get an update from us. So we have a communication. They may not sit on the teams, but we have good communication, and we do a sourcing once a year, a sourcing vendor fair now. And we just started that last year. It's super successful, and we're going to continue, although this year it'll probably be virtual.
All right. Well, I see we're at the top of the hour. And
One
thank you
question
to our,
came
I'm sorry, David?
One question came in.
Okay.
How strong is the requirement of a second source strategy versus a single source that is collaborative?
Repeat the question.
So how strong is the requirement of a second source strategy versus a single source strategy that is collaborative?
Highly collaborative. Okay. I would allow any of the panelists to kind of jump in and tackle that one for a moment.
I'll just say that, you know, all things in balance, right? I mean, there may be times where single source is the way to go. But when that happens, because that increases potential risk that, you know, normally you're trying to remove by doing dual source or multi-source, it does require additional collaboration so that you can really stay on top of that and make sure that any risk that that single source strategy has inherent within it is being addressed literally all the time, full time. You never take the eye off the ball, because it's a big risk. Ask a lot of the companies that have been hurt with COVID-19 right now.
Any other panelists care to comment? Okay. All right. Well, very good. We're at the top of the hour. I'm going to thank everybody who turned out for the webinar today. And of course, express my thanks to these esteemed panelists for joining us and giving some of their precious, good thinking. There's a lot. I actually got my brain opened up here a little bit today. Some things I hadn't thought of quite the way they were presented. We said, that's a new way of thinking about some of these old problems that we face. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you at our next webinar.
All right. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.